Did you know that the sound of a head being chopped off in a movie is the crunch of a frozen watermelon, and the sound of a monster walking is the crunch of a crab's legs? Today's moviegoers know that much of what happens on the screen is created with special effects. You have no idea what tricks producers of big-budget Hollywood movies go to in order to create sound. In this video on Mogol TV, I'll tell you why they beat chicken carcasses, chew celery, and bang coconuts on the floor for famous movies. That's how movie sounds are actually created. Look closely at this scene for a few seconds. Nothing out of the ordinary. It's just raining, but what you heard is not really the sound of rain. It's the recorded sound of frying bacon. Give it a like if you weren't expecting it. Yes, that's the sound of bacon on a frying pan that you hear in many famous movies where there's a rain scene. Why don't they record the sound of real rain? But remember, movies are just an illusion. In fact, bacon in a frying pan sounds much brighter and more interesting as rain than, directly, real rain. That's why the vast majority of the sounds you hear on screen are simulated artificially. Here's another popular example of sound: punching. Almost every other movie has a scene where one character punches another during a boxing match, or in a street fight, or in a battle with aliens. Depending on the story, sound designers use different ideas, one of the most popular being the stabbing of some vegetable like cabbage. Now that you know that, it's not hard to discern a poor cabbage head in this sound. When you want to make a fight sound more realistic, like in Fight Club, you have to use other tools. The film's sound engineer recalls that they used to take chicken carcasses from the store and beat them with a baseball bat. This made the sound of the fist hitting the body less vivid, but more realistic. Sometimes the sound engineer has to voice quite violent scenes, such as the cracking of bones when a character is seriously injured. In practice it looks quite harmless, and no one suffers. Sound men take lettuce leaves, freeze them, and then break them. It sounds perfect, like the sound of breaking bones. For the sound guys, the head-cutting scenes are pretty funny. For example, they can take a machete and hit a frozen watermelon, but the most ideal way is to chop up the green coconut. This is the method often used for execution scenes. Another example of a violent scene in a movie that looks completely harmless in a recording studio is a zombie attacking a person, when the creature begins to sink its teeth into the victim's flesh. Try to guess in the comments how the sound engineer imitated this sound. Write your choices below the video, and we'll see how many of you were able to guess. If a real-life phenomenon is artificially imitated in the studio, what about something no one has ever seen: aliens, monsters, or dinosaurs, for example? In the famous Jurassic Park franchise, director Steven Spielberg wanted the dinosaurs to sound as realistic and believable as possible, as if the characters actually encountered these monsters in our time. So the sound engineers decided to use real animals, and based on that, they came up with a dinosaur growl. They took the sound of a baby elephant, added the roar of the tiger. They also recorded an alligator. They combined all these sounds, slowed them down a bit, and the result was a believable dinosaur. After all, none of us know what it really sounded like. Generally speaking, screaming baby elephants are quite often used to voice various unpleasant creatures, such as orcs from Lord of the Rings or other creatures. In a huge number of adventure movies, characters ride horses. And, as you may have guessed, the sound designers don't use horses at all to imitate the sound of hooves. Instead, they resort to all sorts of tricks. For example, to imitate a light gallop, they take a coconut shell and bang it against a hard surface. That's the sound you get. However, when you need to voice cowboys galloping across the steppe, that sound will look fake. To do this, experts take something heavier, such as rocks, and start pounding them on a surface with sand and dry grass. This makes the sound of a galloping cowboy more realistic. Sound engineers have to go to great lengths to imitate a horse eating. They are forced to cram large amounts of carrots, celery, and nuts into their mouths and chew them as fiercely as possible. The sounds of birds flying in the movies also have nothing to do with real birds. Most likely, it's a sound engineer shaking a sheet or kitchen mitt over a microphone in the studio. Another example of working with the sound of a non-existent monster is the movie Godzilla. To recreate the monster's movement and growl, the sound engineers had to work hard. They recorded their hands rubbing against the surface of the balloon. They also rubbed the leather surface and the strings on the bass guitar with wet rubber shoes, and they even recorded a screaming donkey. By combining all these sounds and working them in a sound editor, the filmmakers were able to get a really scary monster. I've talked before about how cabbages and watermelons are used to voice body kicks, but the funny thing is that when sound engineers need to create a believable sound of a watermelon or melon cracking, it's not enough to take a melon and just crack it. Cinema is an illusion. To make a cracked melon sound juicier, it is wrapped in a damp cloth and only then cracked and crushed in your hands. The sound is as juicy and vibrant as possible. Another cool example of voicing real creatures is the dragonfly. Catching it and recording the sound of its wings is not easy and, as you have already realized, it will not sound good. Therefore, to imitate the flight of a dragonfly, sound engineers take a small hand fan, record its sound, process it a bit, and get a perfect dragonfly. The battle of heroes on sabers or swords is an integral part of films about pirates or knights. But it's not enough just to record the sound of sabers clashing in the studio to simulate a battle. In addition to the ringing, you get an unpleasant squealing sound. To imitate sabers, sound engineers take a violin or cello bow and begin to drive it over some iron object. Sound without screeching is obtained. Monsters in horror films must not only growl menacingly, but also inspire terror through their movements. The sound director of The Quiet Place used to break the legs of a crab in front of a microphone to imitate the monster's footsteps. And to imitate the sound of a monster listening intently, the sound engineers took grapes and beat them with electric shocks. Then they worked on this sound in the program and got the desired result. Perhaps the most common sound that directors around the world have to imitate is footsteps. There are a million varieties of footstep sounds: footsteps on asphalt, on gravel, steps on the floor, and a huge number of varieties, depending on what surface the character of the film walks on, in what shoes, and on whether the character is an adult or a child. For this purpose, recording studios make small areas that are filled with sand, or earth, or other necessary material, and the sound engineer starts wandering around these areas. This sound in the movie sounds much brighter and more realistic than the footsteps of a person recorded on audio for real. To create the sound of a crawling snake, simply put on your rubber gloves and slide them across the sandy surface. To make the sound even more realistic, you can wet the gloves. Even if you're not a fan of the Star Wars franchise, you're still familiar with the sound. That was the sound of the famous blaster, the weapon used by the characters Star Wars. To create that sound, the filmmakers took a cable and hit it with a huge hammer. There is a famous Wolverine character in the X-Men franchise. His main feature is knives that come out of his hand. In order to come up with that sound, the filmmakers used logic. The arm is made of meat and bones, and knives are knives, so they took a chicken carcass from the store and stabbed it with knives, and that's how they got the famous Wolverine sound. Sound directors in movies have to voice not only existing sounds, but also silence. You may wonder how this is possible, because silence is silent, but in fact it is not. You may never have thought about it, but it's impossible to hear complete silence. There are still sounds in the background, such as the noise of cars outside the window, the working refrigerator in the kitchen, and so on. And even if you were placed in a completely soundproof room, you would still hear your own heartbeat. That's why the sound engineer is always voicing the silence, namely the background sounds. And finally, a cool experiment that demonstrates how important sound is in cinema. Watch a short 10-second segment. As you understand, in each of these fragments the image was exactly the same, but because different sound was superimposed, the viewer saw a different story on the screen. That's why almost 100 years ago, the cinema switched from silent to sound. It's much more interesting. Don't forget to like it, also subscribe to the channel, click on the bell to always be aware of new videos and, of course, leave your comments under this video.